My sin is responsible for nailing Christ to the cross. All of us sinners bear that responsibility. So I want to emphasize that this is a much stronger and thoroughly legitimate way of answering the question, did the Jews kill Christ? But even so, there are going to be some people who come back to that and say, well, yeah, Dinesh, but historically someone had to do it, leaving aside the broader spiritual point. Who was the actual group of people that killed Jesus? Weren't they the leadership of the Jews? Weren't they the Jewish establishment? They certainly weren't killed by a bunch of people from some other country or from some other tribe. It wasn't the Babylonians who did it. It wasn't the Hittites who did it. It was, in fact, the Jews. Isn't that right? And here's my answer to that formulation. Yes, that is right. But it is no more accurate to say the Jews. And because remember, when people say the Jews, they don't even just mean the Jews alive then. They somehow mean the Jews as a group, which is all Jews, which is Jews who came subsequently, which is Jews who had nothing to do with any of this, which is Jews who didn't call for Jesus' death. They weren't present. They didn't vote on it. They weren't there shouting, give us Barabbas. They weren't there demanding, they were not in the position of Caiaphas, the high priest, who said essentially that Jesus had to be sacrificed so that the nation might live, so that the people might live. By the way, an unintentional prophecy by Caiaphas, because Caiaphas didn't know what he was saying. What he was really saying is that Jesus' blood would atone for the nation and for the people, and indeed for the sins of the world. But here's the point I'm driving at. The Jews no more killed Christ than, let's say, the Romans killed Caesar. Let's think about this for a minute. How did Julius Caesar die? Well, there was a powerful conspiracy to assassinate him, to execute him. Same with Jesus. Who led the Roman conspiracy? Well, it was a powerful group of Roman aristocrats led by Brutus and Cassius, and they had a lot of allies. But they didn't represent all of Rome. There were lots of people on the other side. They were on Caesar's side. They took up Caesar's cause after his death. They, in fact, ultimately avenged Caesar's death, and Cassius and Brutus were defeated by the forces of Mark Antony and Octavian. So Antony and Octavian, they were Romans too, but they were Romans on the other side of this. And similarly, when you're dealing with Jesus, yeah, the temple establishment opposed him, but lots of people were on Jesus' side. And many of those people, some of them had to run away, go into hiding, the apostles, the disciples, the followers. But guess what? After Jesus died, these people turned it up with a vengeance. They essentially started creating the first churches. And you know what's interesting is that the first churches, some people actually wrongly think that the first churches were started like in the 4th century after Constantine converted to Christianity. No, there were churches, in fact, in Jerusalem in the years right after Jesus' death, but those churches were synagogues. The people in them saw themselves as Jewish, but they were Jewish, but they were Jewish followers of Jesus. In fact, they were the first, and this term is sometimes derided, but it's historically completely accurate. They were the first Judeo-Christian. Some people, they go, Judeo-Christian, Dinesh, stop saying Judeo-Christian. There's no such thing as Judeo-Christian. Actually, there is. The term Judeo-Christian accurately describes the first believers who were all Jewish, including, by the way, all the apostles, every single one. Let's remember, Paul was not an apostle. He wasn't one of the 12. Paul ultimately opened up the preaching to the Gentiles. But even with Paul, when Paul goes to churches in Ephesus and Corinth and churches in Greece and in Asia Minor, where does he preach? In one or two cases, he preaches in public. He might go in Athens. He may go to the Agora. But no, mostly he preaches in synagogues. And what does that mean? He is preaching in Jewish churches to largely Jewish audience. Maybe there was a few Gentiles who also came to hear him, or some Gentiles and Jews, but these were Jewish venues for Jesus to preach. Jesus, of course, was himself Jewish. So the point being that if you're going to say the Jews killed Jesus, well, a whole bunch of other Jews not only followed Jesus, some of them went to their deaths over Jesus, and then they took Jesus' message abroad, initially to the other parts of Europe, then later to the far-flung parts of Europe, and ultimately to the world. So the statement that the Jews killed Jesus, I think, is wrong. It is a scandal. It is a heresy. It is a heresy because it's not just a heresy in the spiritual sense. It's historically uninformed.